want to keep blockchain, but they want to criminalize private Bitcoin transactions. Yeah, well, they've already been building the narrative. So remember the whole October 7th thing? There was reporting that it was later debunked from the Wall Street Journal saying that Hamas financed October 7th using crypto donations, specifically Bitcoin. And then that turned out not to be the case, but it was spread around that, Bitcoin and crypto are being used to fund terrorism. And all these congressmen in the US were like, let's regulate crypto now because, it's being used to fund terrorism. So we need to surveil more closely crypto transactions to prevent that, i.e. reducing financial privacy online, right? So, 2030, it's kind of hard to say what's going to happen between then and now. What I will say as far as the cyber attack stuff, the World Economic Forum, their number 2 guy after Klaus Schwab, in January of this year said that before 2025, there's going to be a massive cyber attack. And if you recall, Klaus Schwab during COVID said stuff like, soon there will be a cyber pandemic that will, in comparison to COVID, make COVID look small by comparison, paraphrasing, but something like that. So the risk of that happening soon, something like that, is very high. They're planning essentially to end online anonymity and financial privacy. And as I mentioned earlier, the DOJ and the FBI and the Secret Service are all members. So are Israeli and UK intelligence, and so are all the big banks. Like Bank of America's on there. And then you've got like Silicon Valley companies. And this WEF partnership against cybercrime, along with the Carnegie Endowment, has an equivalent program. The two of them have been basically pushing for the end of online anonymity, or really online privacy and financial privacy, and also pushing to merge banking regulators and intelligence agencies in the US.
That's why.
Madness.
That's why.
And the guy that was in charge of Carnegie at the time is now CIA director under Biden. And they were basically saying that the way this would be implemented would be through a big cyber attack on the banks. They want to keep blockchain, but they want to criminalize private Bitcoin transactions. Yeah, well, they've already been building the narrative. So remember the whole October 7th thing? There was reporting that it was later debunked from the Wall Street Journal saying that Hamas financed October 7th using crypto donations, specifically Bitcoin. And then that turned out not to be the case, but it was spread around that, Bitcoin and crypto are being used to fund terrorism. And all these congressmen in the US were like, let's regulate crypto now because, it's being used to fund terrorism. So we need to surveil more closely crypto transactions to prevent that, i.e. reducing financial privacy online, right? Something like that. But part of the reason this is happening is because of how they want to, basically Wall Street in the US, these big banks that are part of this whole cybercrime thing are the ones that want to issue a CBDC for the US. It won't be called a CBDC because the central bank won't be issuing it directly, right? But Wall Street probably will be, and they want to be the ones surveilling and controlling and basically having complete control over your finances. And so financial privacy has to go out the window for that to be able to happen, whether it's a CBDC or a Wall Street issued digital dollar. Yeah, well, because in the US, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, is owned by the private banks. So they don't do anything the private banks don't want. And so if you have a direct issued CBDC, like is being piloted in like China and like these other countries around the world where the central bank is directly issuing that currency, basically, for every, in the US, it would mean that for every dollar produced, they would have to hold, one reserve backing it up, like a 1-to-1 ratio. But Wall Street doesn't want that because they engage in something called fractional reserve banking, right. Which is where basically like you deposit $1,000 in the bank and they keep like $10 and, loan out the other 900. And that's why bank runs happen and banks go insolvent and all this stuff. But it also allows them to pump up these crazy Wall Street casinos, and they have no intention of changing their behavior at all. And so they can't have a direct issued CBDC and continue fractional reserve banking. So what they're trying to do is have something called deposit tokens or bank issued stable coins, where they get to all these private banks, these Wall Street banks hold the reserves and can do fractional reserve banking with it. Because if the Fed were doing it, then the Fed would have to keep it in that 1-to-1 ratio. But if Wall Street is doing it, then they can keep their insane casino going on forever. While also, surveilling Americans on behalf of intelligence, which is why you have this push I mentioned earlier to merge banks and intelligence agencies going on with all of this. So instead of, Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve on behalf of the government programming and surveilling you through a CBDC, it will be Jamie Dimon doing it. So, 2030s, it's kind of hard to say what's going to happen between then and now. What I will say as far as the cyber attack stuff, the World Economic Forum, their number 2 guy after Klaus Schwab, in January of this year said that before 2025, there's going to be a massive cyber attack. And if you recall, Klaus Schwab during COVID said stuff like, soon there will be a cyber pandemic that will, in comparison to COVID, make COVID look small by comparison, paraphrasing, but something like that. So the risk of that happening soon, something like that, is very high. And of course, if something like that does happen in the US, there will be a Cyber Patriot Act that will be rushed through. And some particular nation state, we can probably guess which ones, will be blamed. And as has been the case up to this point, when a nation state, whether it's Iran, China, or Russia, or any of the bad guys, are blamed, the reasons for attribution are practically non-existent, or it's all intelligence fronts attributing the blame. Like this recent one blaming China for infiltrating U.S. infrastructure was this company called Recorded Future that was created with In-Q-Tel money. That's the CIA. Yeah. And there was no pushback on that all from the media, just this headline of China's infiltrating everything. So imagine if a big cyber attack happens, how that will be.
Whitney,
when that happens, the enemy, it's very clear, is going to be privacy. No one can be online. We have to know who everyone is online to stop these acts of cyber terrorism, whether that act of cyber terrorism is misinformation or a big hack or critical infrastructure goes down. It could be all of those things. It could be one of those things. It doesn't really matter. And if you think about stuff like the anthrax attack in 2001 and the panic that generated, that killed under 10 people. But was just the fear and panic from it was able to push through a ton of biosecurity legislation that helped bring us what happened during COVID-19. So they don't necessarily need a big death count, but the head of DHS said that the next cyber attack is going to be killware, which definitely sounds scary.
Come on.
Yeah, look it up. Look it up. Mayorkas talking about killware, saying it's the next big thing in cybersecurity. Yeah, so, people should be really aware that this is going to happen, and there's going to be a push to link your ID, your government-issued ID, it'll be a digital ID because of where things are going, to your internet access. And this has been the goal from a very long time, going back to when, after 9/11, they tried to create total information awareness, the DARPA program. They want to know not just what you're posting online, they want to see what you're reading online also. Literally everything you do online, all your financial activity, they want all of it.
Like Jesus has?
And if you listen, it's wild. And if you listen to people like Eric Schmidt, who was recently talking about what he feels like needs to be done to stop misinformation.
Eric Schmidt is the former head of Google. If you post misinformation,
I'm sorry.
To tell people who Eric Schmidt is.
He's the former CEO of Google. Basically, Henry Kissinger named him his heir before he died.
Oh, that's awesome.
And he's the guy that's funding the salaries of the people in the Biden administration, which should be totally illegal, by the way, and completely dominates science and technology policy of the Biden administration.
And what did he say?
That people who publish or post misinformation on social media should be reported to law enforcement. So, I am not like a financial expert or advisor, so I don't feel comfortable telling people exactly where to put their money. But what I do personally is I try and put my money in things I will need if the world gets totally insane. So I don't have to worry about feeding my family, how I'm going to have lights on in my house and all sorts of stuff like
guns.
that.
Guns and gold?
I mean, whatever works for you, but I think what's important for people is to sort of think through this stuff because, knowing people, for example, in Argentina, their economy collapsed in 2001. For talking to people who lived through that, they've all said that if you give in to the panic, that's the worst thing you can possibly do. Like mental preparedness is very important. And that doesn't cost anything, does it? And also, if, I mean, the internet's going to be heavily censored, it would make sense to back up information you care and value and you think you might need in the future offline also. So like I live in Chile, so it's a lot easier for me than it would have been if I lived in the US still. But I bought a little plot of land and saved up for like 15 years and have a little house on it, so I don't have to pay rent anymore. You know, gonna try and grow as much of my own food as possible. You know, have sort of my own water supply, stuff like that. I mean, not obviously it's gonna look different for everyone based on, you know, your situation. Maybe stock up on, you know, a couple weeks of groceries or something if stuff goes insane. I mean, we saw what happened with COVID where everything got shut down for a couple weeks. You know, what happens if some crazy crisis happens and, you know, the grocery stores aren't working normally or you can't get into one normally.
Oh, order from Amazon like again because they were still open.
Or pay with your palm to get your well, you know, it's crazy. The UN is moving all of their humanitarian assistance programs to basically like the world coin model, like scan your eyeball. If you want, you know, your humanitarian rations. It's called Building Blocks, the World Food Program. Insanely Orwellian. They onboarded like millions of Ukrainians onto that recently. But a lot of Palestinian refugees in Jordan have been living like that for years. And people around the world, and they're basically like, oh, you want food? You want to live? Give us your iris scan. Not cool. No, I'm pretty optimistic about it because I think people have really had enough, but I think people need to keep in mind too that like the online information space, even now, is more manipulated than it's ever been. And I think most Americans and people generally are just really like checked out and really aren't buying all of this, and so much is going on. There's so many like sophisticated bots in this chat GPT era that are trying to make us feel pessimistic, I think. Because if people, I mean, I feel like this happened in 2016 where they tried to demoralize people by being like putting out all these polls saying like Hillary Clinton's definitely going to win. It's like 99% probable. And then it wasn't like that at all. I think they do that kind of influence ops all the time to try and, you know, demoralize people. And so I think it's very important to spend time in the real world and not just online, specifically when you're trying to gauge public opinion about these things. And when you do that, it's very hard not to be hopeful because people get it. And I think, you know, whether in the US or Chile, I mean, people know that the big banks, the powerful corporations, and the politicians who are in bed with them steal from the people and want to keep stealing. And if you, you know, approach it from that, you know, people get that and don't want that to continue and are fed up and sort of checked out, you know. But if you go online, I mean, it's a totally different world half the time. So, I don't know. It helps to unplug to keep your head straight, which the idea of the whole digital ID thing is to have this one ID tied to literally everything you do, including all of your online activity, your medical history, you know, your cell phone carrier, your travel. I mean, literally everything. Have all of this in one centralized place that, you know, is very likely that basically intelligence agencies are going to use to surveil you. And the real danger of it is that they're going to use this to sort of do predictive policing is what they call, which is what Palantir, the contractor for all of this in the US, has been doing for a long time to try and predict crime before it happens. And there was a big push for this under the Trump administration. From William Barr specifically, he said it was about stopping mass shootings before they can happen. And they were trying to create this organization modeled after DARPA called HARPA, which Biden actually made. It's called ARPA-H. They just moved one letter to the end.
Oh my God.
From Trump's.
They don't predict shit. But
I know, but it was putting... I know, but it's not about that. That's what they say it's about. There's the public justification, right? And so basically they wanted to put AI in charge of going through people's social media history to identify warning signs in people who might be violent in the future, and all of this stuff. So if you apply this to all this other misinformation stuff and treating misinformation, which we know is just information the state doesn't agree with most of the time, to a crime or to terrorism, it starts to get really insane. And the best way to stop this is to opt out of big tech and opt out of big social media and start building or looking for some sort of alternative, because they're very complacent in the sense that they think everyone's going to stay dependent on all of these platforms and services. And we can make alternatives, or we can do something else. We don't have to use, Google and Microsoft, who are all contractors with the IDF and, U.S. intelligence and the government and all of this stuff. We don't have to do that. We can do something else. And then it all falls apart for them if we starve them of our data.